I just want to be clear about this. I don't have beef with Liquid Zulu, okay? I just disagree with him about some of his arguments during our debate. Now, let me just say this. I don't think I'm the greatest debater. Please roast me in the comments. However, I do know how to think and write, and that's why I wanted to clarify my positions post our debate. So, if you haven't already seen it, I had a debate with Zulu about his moral justification for the NAP. I made it clear at the beginning of our discussion that I have zero qualms with his practical justification of the NAP, meaning that I think society would be beneficial for everyone regardless of whether it's moral or not. This entire discussion revolved around the idea of an intrinsically moral justification. However, Zulu doesn't really agree with me on this point. Okay, wait, so I might be a little bit confused. So from what I understand, you don't see a differentiation between moral in a practical sense and a intrinsic sense. I see those things as distinct because I see this as utilitarians will essentially say that moral is practical. So what we need to do is the thing that's most practical, and that's morality, meaning, like taxes, Keynesian ethics, communism, all that shit. And then there will be deontologists and moral virtue ethicists who will say that we do something because it is good. We don't do something because it's good for us. We do something because it's intrinsically good. So I see those things as distinct. I see moral practicality and moral objectivity as two distinct things.
Right, I think this is a false alternative you've given me here. You're saying either we've got to be pragmatists, and then it's all just about practicality, or we've got to be intrinsicists, where it's some sort of duty ethics. I think that's a false alternative here, because being practical doesn't mean abandoning morality. It doesn't mean doing bad things. Things can be bad without it being some sort of rule decreed onto people by God.
Here, I'm arguing that moral practicality refers to actions or principles that are valuable because they serve one's self-interests, or are useful in achieving practical outcomes. For example, the non-aggression principle is practical because it reduces conflict and promotes social stability. I argue that intrinsic morality refers to actions or principles that are valuable in and of themselves, independent of the practical outcomes. For example, something is morally right simply because it is inherently good or just. While I agree that the NAP is practical, I'm not convinced that it's morally justified in an intrinsic sense. I'm asking for a deeper moral rationale beyond the practical benefits. Zulu argues that there isn't a strict dichotomy between practicality and morality. He suggests that practical actions can also be morally justified, and being practical doesn't mean abandoning intrinsic moral values. Zulu might believe that practical principles like the NAP can be both pragmatically effective and morally justified. In other words, practical outcomes and intrinsic morality can coexist, and one doesn't necessarily exclude the other. But here's the thing. I'm not arguing that moral practicality and intrinsic morality are mutually exclusive. Rather, I'm asking for a moral justification as opposed to a practical one, which is entirely reasonable within the context of this debate. I've already agreed that the NAP is practical, meaning it serves rational self-interest, reduces conflict, and has beneficial outcomes in the world. What I'm now asking is for a justification that goes beyond practicality, a reason why the NAP is morally justified in an intrinsic sense, meaning why it is inherently right or valuable, independent of its practical benefits. Zulu's assertion that I'm presenting a false alternative might stem from a misunderstanding of my position. He seems to be interpreting a distinction between moral practicality and intrinsic morality as suggesting that one must exclude the other, which I've clarified is not the case. Zulu might believe that the practical benefits of the NAP, like reducing conflict and promoting cooperation, are part of what makes it morally justified. This is a common view in certain ethical frameworks, like consequentialism, where practical outcomes are integral to moral justification. There's nothing wrong with exploring the intrinsic moral justification for the NAP without denying the practical benefits that I've already acknowledged. In doing so, I'm asking for an explanation that addresses why the NAP should be considered morally right or obligatory beyond its practical usefulness. It's perfectly legitimate to ask for a moral justification that isn't solely based on practical outcomes, especially if the debate is centered on whether the NAP is morally justified rather than just practically justified. I'm not saying that practicality and intrinsic morality are mutually exclusive. I'm simply asking for a moral justification that stands apart from the practical one I've already granted. While Zulu might believe that practicality and morality are connected, he still needs to address my specific request for an intrinsic moral justification.
And then there's the mixed law, the system which is just some in between. And I think both the law of the jungle and mixed law fall into what I call the primacy of consciousness, which is a stolen concept fallacy. So because those are both out, we're left with only the NAP as the reasonable solution to law.
Yeah, no, I agree with you about the law, but wouldn't you say that the law is practical, not moral?
No, I would say the law is moral. I don't think there is. I don't think something can be practical but not moral.
Wait, so then why ought we do something?
Well, then you're asking for the positive case. So in law, I gave the basic positive case above, that the three possibilities, out of the three possibilities we have, the non-aggression principle is the only one that it doesn't rely on a stolen concept. So the NAP is the only one that we have left. So it's the correct solution to law.
But for
That's
example,
the positive case for the NAP.
But so for example, if you got out of bed today, if I ask you why you got out of bed today, what would your answer be?
So I had work to do.
Why would you do work?
Oh, because if I don't do work, then I'm not producing anything, and then I'll live either as a parasite, which I think is profoundly evil, or I'll die. Right? And I don't want to die, so.
Okay, why don't you want to die?
Well,
or why ought you not die?
Right?
What?
Why would I want to die is the question.
Well, I think the better question is why would you want to live?
Sure. So living is a good thing. I think clearly we both accept this. So I'm not sure where you're going to go with that.
Why is living a good thing?
Well, life is the standard of ethics. It doesn't make any sense. Like, you can't have a value which is death. That's a stolen concept. It doesn't make any sense to say that. It doesn't make any sense you are operating on just complete, utter falsehood if you are engaged in a pursuit of death. Now, I can elaborate on this. So, that you have this concept of value, we have to ask, where is this a primary, or does value rely on something before it for you to even have that concept in the first place? And the answer that Ayn Rand gives, which I mean we could go into that if you wanted, but it is an NAP debate. The answer that she gives is that the concept of value relies on the concept life, because it's only for living beings that value means anything at all. It's only living beings which have the alternative of existence or non-existence, so they have to pursue things, right, to keep themselves existing. That's why a rock doesn't have values, it doesn't pursue anything, because it's not alive. Where it's like, well, why shouldn't we pursue death? Well, that's just a stolen concept. You're pursuing something whilst eschewing any sort of standard of value. So then what the hell does a value mean? So yeah, it would be theft that he's stolen the concept of, which is funny.
Okay, so then what did I steal a concept of when I said, why ought we live?
So so that specifically isn't stealing concept. I'm saying the alternative to life is the standard. is stealing the concept of value. Because the concept of value, you only get to that because you have the prior concept of life. It makes no sense to have value as just this floating thing. You can't just have, because value is not the primary. So all of these ethical theorists, plenty of them at least throughout history, they've treated value as something intrinsic, which is one of the examples you gave, where it's just some command from God, do this just because. That is stealing the concept of value, because what do they actually mean by value there? It means value is when you obey God's word, right? That's not what it means, right? If we actually look out and we actually observe where values come from, where we see values, we don't see values in inanimate matter. We only see it in living beings. It's only living beings that pursue things. It's only living beings that do this stuff. So it is life that is the prerequisite and standard of value. And what I mean by standard is that you need some sort of way to evaluate, right? Some way to pick what you're going to pursue, right? It can't just be whatever you want, because that is called whim worship, which rests on a whim epistemology, which is the claim that this is true because I feel like it's true.
It appears Zulu's suggesting that my question, why ought I live, is an example of what's known as the stolen concept fallacy. This fallacy occurs when someone uses a concept while ignoring or contradicting the very foundation that makes that concept meaningful or valid. The fallacy involves using a concept that logically depends on another concept, while simultaneously rejecting or ignoring that underlying concept. Essentially, it's when someone steals a concept without acknowledging its necessary foundation. The idea here is that the concept of valuing something, whether it's life, happiness, meaning, inherently depends on being alive. Without life, the capacity to value anything doesn't exist. Thus, the ability to ask the question, why ought I live, presupposes the value of life, because without life, the question itself wouldn't arise. Zulu is arguing that by asking, why ought I live, I'm questioning the value of life, while simultaneously depending on the fact that I'm alive to even pose the question. In other words, I'm using the concept of ought or value while ignoring that these concepts only make sense if life is already valued. Because without life, there's no I to value or consider anything. The criticism is that Zulu's question involves a contradiction because it challenges the value of life, yet the very act of questioning requires me to be alive and thus implicitly value life. By asking the question, I'm already assuming the value of life, which makes the question self-defeating or fallacious under this reasoning. Zulu's argument, which points out that I'm currently choosing to live, does describe my current state of being and is, but it doesn't necessarily address the normative question of why I ought to live. Zulu is pointing out that I'm currently alive and making choices that sustain my life. This observation is descriptive. It states what is happening. I am alive and choosing life. The question I'm asking, why ought I live, is normative. It's asking for a justification or reason why I should continue to live. This seeks a deeper moral or philosophical answer beyond just the fact that I am alive. Zulu might be suggesting that my choice to live is evidence that I implicitly value life, even if I'm questioning it. This could be seen as an argument that my actions reveal an underlying commitment to life. However, pointing out that I'm choosing to live only describes what I'm doing. It doesn't provide a reason why I should continue to live. The fact that I am currently choosing to live doesn't answer the question of whether I ought to live or provide justification for it. My question is asking for a normative reason. Why should life be considered valuable, or why should I continue to live? This is a separate inquiry from the observation that I'm currently alive and choosing to live. This is a separate inquiry from the observation that I am currently alive and choosing life. The answer to why ought I live could involve various philosophical perspectives, such as the intrinsic value of life, the pursuit of meaning or happiness, moral duties to oneself or others, or even existentialist ideas that I must create my own meaning. By pointing out that I'm choosing to live, Zulu may be avoiding the deeper philosophical question of justification. Just because I am alive doesn't mean there isn't a valid and important question about whether or why I should continue to live. The argument that I'm alive, so I must value life, might indicate an implicit valuation of life, but it doesn't provide a full answer to the normative question of why I should continue to live. Okay, so I don't think practicality actually links with intrinsic morality. Practicality describes what works in the world, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what ought to be done from a moral standpoint. And that kind of brings us to the is-ought gap, doesn't it?
We can go there if you want, sure.
But isn't that what it does? You haven't solved the is-ought gap, have you?
No, I absolutely have.
Oh, you have?
I don't think it poses any sort of problem at all. There's this argument against it called companions in guilt. So what the is-ought gap, Hume's guillotine, right? What Hume is claiming is that, you should only believe in certain things. You should only believe in things that you can see, or taste, touch, things that some reputable guy tells you about, yada 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 yada, right? He's just giving the standard sensualist claim there. But that itself is an epistemic norm. He's saying you should only believe in these things. But wait a minute, his epistemic norm here is supposed to exclude any sort of should claims. So it defeats itself. It cannot stand as any sort of attack on any morality.
Wait, so then why ought we do something?
Well, then you're asking for the positive case. So in law, I gave the basic positive case above, that the three possibilities, out of the three possibilities we have, the non-aggression principle is the only one that it doesn't rely on a stolen concept. So the NEP is the only one that we have left. So it's the correct solution to law. Sure. So living is a good thing. I think clearly we both accept this. So I'm not sure where you're going to go with that.
Why is living a good thing?
Well, life is the standard of ethics. It doesn't make any sense. You can't have a value which is death. That's a stolen concept. It doesn't make any sense to say that. It doesn't make any sense you are operating on just complete, utter falsehood if you are engaged in a pursuit of death. Now, I can elaborate on this. So, that you have this concept of value, we have to ask, where is this a primary, or does value rely on something before it for you to even have that concept in the first place? And the answer that Ayn Rand gives, which we could go into that if you wanted, but it is an NAP debate. The answer that she gives is that the concept of value relies on the concept life, because it's only for living beings that value means anything at all. It's only living beings which have the alternative of existence or non-existence, so they have to pursue things, right, to keep themselves existing. That's why a rock doesn't have values, it doesn't pursue anything, because it's not alive.
Zulu seems to be suggesting that my current actions, specifically my choice to continue living, somehow justifies what I ought to do. This approach conflates descriptive statements, what I am doing, with normative claims, what I should do, which can lead to significant logical problems. The argument Zulu is making appears to fall into the classic is-ought problem. Hume pointed out that I cannot derive an ought, a prescriptive statement about what should be, directly from an is, a descriptive statement about what is. Just because I am doing something, in this case living, doesn't automatically provide a justification that I ought to continue doing it. Actions describe what is happening, but they don't inherently carry a prescriptive force. Zulu's argument seems to assume that my behavior, choosing to live, provides a justification for that behavior. However, this reasoning is circular. It uses the action itself as the reason for why the action is justified, which doesn't provide an independent rationale. A normative claim typically requires an external standard or principle that provides a reason for why one ought to act in a certain way. Simply pointing out what one is already doing doesn't establish why it is right or necessary to do that thing. Imagine someone says, "I am currently eating unhealthy food, so that means I ought to eat unhealthy food." This reasoning would be clearly flawed. Just because someone is doing something doesn't mean it's justified or that they should continue doing it. Similarly, I am currently procrastinating, so I ought to procrastinate. Again, the mere fact that someone is engaging in an activity doesn't provide a justification for it being the right course of action. By focusing on what I am doing, living, and treating it as self-justifying, Zulu avoids engaging with the deeper question of why life should be valued, or what reasons there might be for continuing to live. The argument sidesteps the need to provide a substantive justification for the value of life. If we were to accept the idea that what we are doing is automatically what we ought to be doing, it would render all moral and philosophical inquiry pointless. Any action could be justified simply by the fact that it is being done. To answer the question, why ought I live, I would need to identify reasons or values that justify living. These could be ethical principles, the pursuit of meaning, personal goals, or duties to oneself or others. Actions alone don't provide these justifications. I need independent reasons that can stand apart from the mere fact that I am currently performing the action. But isn't that what it does? You haven't solved the is-ought gap, have you?
Oh, I absolutely have.
Oh, you have?
I don't think it poses any sort of problem at all. There's this argument against it called companions in guilt. So what the is-ought gap, Hume's guillotine, right? What Hume is claiming is that, you should only believe in certain things. You should only believe in things that you can see, or taste, touch, things that some reputable guy tells you about, yada 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 yada, right? He's just giving the standard sensualist claim there. But that itself is an epistemic norm. He's saying you should only believe in these things. But wait a minute, his epistemic norm here is supposed to exclude any sort of should claims. So it defeats itself. It cannot stand as any sort of attack on any morality.
Right, that's true. My problem is just with moral objectivism, which, Zulu basically said that there is a way to, I forget what exactly he said, but I think he said that there is a way to breach the is-ought gap, which I just don't understand.
What's your
Yes, I think the... Oh, sorry, you go ahead.
What's your evidence that the gap exists in the first place?
It's not a matter of me saying the gap doesn't exist. It's a matter of me not understanding how to cross the gap.
But the gap doesn't exist. So what is your evidence that there's a such gap in the first place? I'm denying the existence of the gap.
So the evidence would be something like this. And I asked Zulu the same question, but essentially I would say, why ought I live? It's a very simple question, but the answer is not so simple. Now we know that people do have values, and we know that people chase their values, but we don't know why people should chase their values.
Well, it's very simple. The ought comes from the is. They're not separate in the first place. Why ought you live? Because living is the thing that makes values possible. That's how simple it is. There's nothing you can change about that situation. That is the is. And since living makes values possible, it is a value, and then you ought to follow certain moral codes so you can follow the is. And there's nothing you can do to change the is. Ought follows the is. The dichotomy actually never existed in the first place. Hume was being wrong.
The companions in guilt argument is a way to defend the idea that moral facts are real and objective, just like other kinds of facts we believe in. It says that if I reject the idea that moral facts are real, then I might also have to reject other facts that we all generally agree are real. A moral fact is something like, it's wrong to lie. And an epistemic fact is something like, it's good to believe what is supported by evidence. Both types of facts tell us what we should do. Morals tell us how to behave, and epistemic facts tell us how to think. For instance, if moral facts are just opinions, why not say the same about the idea that I should believe what's supported by evidence? If that's just an opinion, then there's no real reason to follow it. And that leads to problems because we all rely on the idea that there are good and bad ways to think or reason. The problem with this argument is that it presupposes we ought to seek truth. If it's not accepted that we ought to seek truth, then the foundation crumbles. Practical truth seeking is when we seek truth for practical reasons. Who would have thought? We do so because it helps us achieve other goals. This form of practical truth seeking is conditional on the desired outcomes. Practical truth seeking doesn't necessarily commit me to the idea that truth is intrinsically valuable or that all truths must be sought. I might value truth only when it serves a particular purpose. Intrinsic truth seeking means valuing truth as an end in itself, not just as a means to other goals. This perspective holds that truth is inherently good, and we ought to pursue it regardless of the practical outcomes. If truth is valued intrinsically, there is a broader and more universal obligation to seek truth in all areas of life, including moral and ethical truths. If I seek truth only for practical reasons, this doesn't necessarily support moral realism. I might follow moral norms because they lead to better social outcomes or personal satisfaction, but I wouldn't be committed to the idea that these norms are objectively true in an intrinsic sense. For example, I might adhere to the non-aggression principle because it leads to more peaceful and a stable society. But this doesn't mean I believe that the NAP is intrinsically true or that it reflects an objective moral reality. The original companions in guilt argument says that if I reject moral facts as objective, I should also reject other types of facts, like those about reasoning. It relies on the idea that we all agree we should seek truth. But if I don't believe we ought to seek truth, the original argument isn't very convincing. The reformulated argument says that moral norms, what's right or wrong, and reasoning norms, how we should think, are deeply connected. I can't easily reject one without messing up the other. For example, when I argue or make decisions, I rely on both moral rules, like fairness, and reasoning rules, like logic. They work together. The reformulated argument may concede that we don't have to accept that truth seeking is intrinsically valuable, but still argue that there are strong normative reasons to follow both epistemic and moral norms if we want to achieve certain goals, like effective communication, social cooperation, or rational decision-making. But the same problem occurs here. The reformulated companions in guilt argument still presupposes that we ought to care about things like consistency, rational decision-making, and effective communication. The reformulated argument emphasizes the interdependence of various norms, moral, epistemic, practical, and argues that rejecting one, like moral norms, could undermine the others. This connection suggests that there's an underlying value placed on truth-seeking, rationality, and consistency as essential for coherent reasoning and decision-making. For the argument to hold, it assumes that the person it's addressing values rationality and consistency, which are closely tied to truth-seeking. Rationality involves forming beliefs and making decisions based on evidence and logical coherence, which are all aspects of truth-seeking. When I value truth instrumentally, I value it as a tool or a means to achieve other goals. For example, I might seek truth because it helps me make better decisions, solve problems, or achieve practical success. In this case, truth is valuable only because it leads to desirable outcomes. My commitment to truth would be context dependent. I pursue truth in situations where it helps me achieve my goals, but I might not feel the need to seek truth in every situation. especially if it doesn't serve my purposes. When I value truth intrinsically, I see it as something worth pursuing for its own sake, regardless of the consequences. This means I'm committed to seeking truth in all situations, even when it might not lead to practical benefits. An intrinsic value of truth suggests a universal commitment to truth-seeking, implying that I would follow epistemic norms, like honesty and logical consistency, in all areas of life. If I only value truth instrumentally, I might follow epistemic norms when it's practical or beneficial to do so, but I wouldn't feel compelled to accept them as universally binding. This allows me to selectively apply norms based on the context and my goals. By valuing truth only instrumentally, I avoid the argument that I need to accept moral realism because of the connection between epistemic and moral norms. I could argue that I follow moral or epistemic norms only when they serve my purposes, not because they are inherently true or objectively binding. The companions in guilt argument, whether in its original or reformulated form, does not provide a reason for why someone ought to do something, particularly if that person doesn't already accept the underlying values or norms that the argument assumes. The argument assumes that certain norms, like truth-seeking rationality and consistency, are valuable and that people should follow them. However, it doesn't establish why someone ought to value these norms if they don't already do so. The argument can show that if I accept certain norms, like epistemic norms, then I might also have to accept moral norms for consistency. But it doesn't explain why I ought to accept any norms in the first place, especially if I don't already value truth or consistency. For someone who questions whether they ought to seek truth, be rational, or follow moral rules, the companions in guilt argument doesn't have the force to compel them. It doesn't provide an independent reason to adopt these values. It only works if I already share the underlying assumptions. In other words, the companions in guilt argument assumes that I care about certain norms, but doesn't tell me why I ought to care about them in the first place. It's effective for those who already value things like truth-seeking or rationality, but doesn't persuade someone who doesn't see these as necessary or inherently valuable. Essentially, Zulu is using an ought to get to an ought, not an is to get to an ought. Yeah, that's a good question. What the hell is a value? But I think this brings us back to the question of why should we do anything? And the question kind of hints at a more fundamental, like, intuitive response, right? I would say that it probably boils down to a certain intuitionism where why do we act? We act intuitively and we act purposefully, but we act purposefully based on our intuitions and our preferences. And so we need to sort of, I guess, deconstruct what that means as an intuition and see why we ought to do anything. Because, and hear me out for a second, we might disagree on this. It appears to me that the most logical outcome of life, if your meaning in life and your purpose in life is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, is to just choose non-existence. Because I would argue that the vast majority of people live a more painful life than a good life. So wouldn't the logical ends of that just be choosing non-existence so that you could have peace?
Well, you've gone through a few different threads there. I'll address the first one first, right? I don't think that why ought we do something is just based on intuition. If somebody is acting on intuition, that means they just haven't checked their premises fully enough. The reason why we ought to do things is because we are living beings, right? So we need to pursue values to stay alive, or else we go out of existence.
In this section, I argue that the question of why should we do anything ultimately hints at a fundamental intuitive basis for action. I suggest that human action is driven by intuitive and purposeful responses that align with our preferences. Essentially, people act based on what they intuitively feel is important or necessary, according to their preferences and goals. I'm suggesting that our actions are rooted in an intuitive understanding of what we want or value, which isn't easy to break down or fully explain. It's more of a basic underlying drive that informs our behavior. Zulu disagrees with the idea that the reason we ought to do something is based on intuition. He argues that if someone acts purely on intuition, they might not have critically examined their premises or reasons. In other words, intuition alone is insufficient for determining what one ought to do, because it doesn't involve a careful logical examination of why something is right or necessary. Zulu then asserts that the reason we ought to do things is because we are living beings. Essentially, because we are living, there are certain things we should do to sustain or fulfill that life. I respond by pointing out that logic in itself is descriptive rather than prescriptive. Logic can tell us what follows from certain premises, what is the case, but it doesn't inherently tell us what we ought to do. This aligns with the classic distinction between descriptive and normative statements, the is-ought problem. I'm arguing that logic alone can't inform us of moral duties or obligations. It can't generate an ought from an is. Therefore, simply being a living being doesn't automatically tell us what we should do. I asked, why ought we do something? This question seeks a justification for action that goes beyond just stating that we are alive or acting based on intuition. Zulu responded by saying that if we act based on intuition, it means we haven't checked our premises, and that the reason we ought to do things is because we are living beings. This response suggests that Zulu is focused on grounding moral obligations in the fact that we are alive, but it doesn't directly answer the why behind the ought. Zulu's answer assumes that being alive is a sufficient reason for having moral obligations, but it doesn't explain why this is the case. He's asserting that because we're alive, we ought to act in certain ways, but he hasn't provided a deeper justification for why being alive creates these obligations. My question is asking for a reason why we ought to do something, which requires a normative justification. Simply stating that we are alive doesn't bridge the gap between what is and what we ought to do. The response doesn't engage with the deeper philosophical issue of what justifies moral obligations. Zulu seems to be concerned with whether actions based on intuition are well grounded or logical, but this doesn't directly answer my question about why we have moral obligations at all. The emphasis on checking premises might be relevant to how we reason about actions, but it doesn't explain the fundamental ought I'm asking about. So, what should I have done? I could have clarified that my question is not about whether intuition or logic is the best guide for action, but rather about the underlying justification for why we have moral obligations or why we ought to do anything at all. I could have pressed Zulu to provide a reason why being alive entails certain obligations, or why living beings in particular ought to act in specific ways. What is the connection between the fact of being alive and the moral ought he's proposing? Why does being alive create moral obligations? What is it about being a living being that creates an ought? Is it because life has intrinsic value? If so, why does life have this value? I might have asked Zulu to clarify how he believes logic can inform us of moral obligations. What premises or principles is he relying on to derive an ought from the fact of being alive? So, do you believe in moral objectivism? I'm assuming you do, since you believe in morality.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's probably a good route for us to go. Let me see. Okay. So moral objectivism. I have my problems with moral objectivism. Moral objectivism seems to be this idea that there is intrinsic moral value, and from your perspective, it seems like you would link this with practicality. So,
hold on. Hold on. You've made a mistake there. You've conflated objective and intrinsic there. Like there is objectively correct things in morality. That you can be objective in morality. That doesn't imply that morality is some rules coming from outside of you, just imposed upon you.
I'm confused, because moral objectivism is the idea that morality exists independent of us, right? It's true in the universe.
if that is what is meant by moral objectivism, then I'm not a moral objectivist.
Oh, okay.
I'm an objectivist, and objectivism holds that you can indeed come to a rational morality.
I already sort of talked about this, but I just want to be clear. There is a difference between practical and intrinsic morality. Moral objectivism is the view that there are objective moral truths or facts that exist independently of human beliefs, feelings, or perceptions. According to moral objectivism, certain actions or principles are morally wrong or right, regardless of individual opinions, cultural differences, and subjective experiences. Moral truths are universal and apply to all people at all times, in all places. In the context of our debate, there are two ways of thinking about morality that I'm distinguishing. Practical morality refers to moral principles or actions that are justified based on their outcomes or consequences. Intrinsic morality refers to the idea that certain actions or principles are morally right or wrong in themselves, regardless of the consequences. If I'm a moral objectivist who subscribes to practical morality, I would believe that there are objective moral truths about which actions produce the best outcomes. For example, maximizing happiness or minimizing harm. I might believe that it is objectively true that kindness leads to better social cohesion, and therefore kindness is morally right. If I'm a moral objectivist who subscribes to intrinsic morality, I would believe that there are objective moral truths about what is inherently right or wrong, independent of the consequences. In our debate, if I'm seeking a moral justification that is not based on practical outcomes but on intrinsic value, I'm asking for an explanation which aligns with moral objectivism in the sense of intrinsic morality, where certain actions are objectively right or wrong, independent of their consequences. Meaning, there must be a distinction between practical and intrinsic. So, those are my thoughts on the debate. I know there were some other points that could have used extra clarity, but I at least wanted to address the largest points. Again, I want to say that I have nothing against Zulu and agree with him on pretty much 99% of all issues. I just had a problem with his reasoning in this particular case. If you think I'm wrong, I'm more than happy to hear your thoughts in the comments or discuss this further with anyone. So, yeah, go ahead and roast me.